Welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams Birch, and this podcast, it exists for you. Whether you're a music lover, an educator, a choir member, each week we bring guests to the show to help explore what matters in music. I'm so glad that you're here. Welcome to the show. Hello, and welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast Women's History Month series. Before we kick off the guests for this month, I wanted to give you a little bit of history about Women's History Month. March is designated as Women's History Month because of a presidential proclamation in 1980. But it started before then. In fact, in the late 70s, there were a couple of congresswomen that got together and decided that they wanted to ask for a Women's History Day. And it's a really funny story, actually, when you hear it, because they were talking about how they didn't want to have it in August, because we know August 26th is when women earned the right to vote. And so Susan Scanlon, one of the legislators at the time, said, well, we don't really want to do it then because who wants to be marching in August when it's hot? And there's this really great YouTube video of her telling this story. You can find it at womenshistory.org. Anyway, they picked March because March 8th was also a really important day in women's history. And so they chose March 8th, and President Jimmy Carter signed it into action in 1980, made it March 2nd to March 8th, and it's been a thing ever since. So just like in February, we raised the voices of Black educators and Black musicians. I'm really excited to raise the voices of dynamite women doing things in the field of music and music education. I really hope that just like last month, you're able to engage, learn, and act based on what you're learning from these episodes. Hello, and welcome to the Music Ed Matters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Williams Birch, and this episode is part of Women's History Month. We are elevating the voices of women doing awesome things in all sorts of fields and professions. And this episode today features my friend, Dr. Amy Williams, the executive director of the Savannah Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, I met Dr. Williams doing a triathlon. That's another story for another time, but we connected right away. She is a get after it and go. And in this conversation, you'll hear why. We talk about her process of discovering the bassoon, which started not with bassoon and with some very interesting behaviors that I know my music educators out there are going to laugh hysterically about. But we talked about her process of getting that doctorate in her bassoon performance, and then how that led to becoming manager, program director, education director, and eventually executive director of a variety of community orchestras. Now, Dr. Williams talks about so many things in this episode, from how to build collaborations and meaningful partnerships, how to stay true to your authentic meaning and mission, how to get past barriers. She calls it squashing the why. And I love the moment in this episode where she gives advice for when you interview. I want you to hear from Amy, but we know this episode is brought to you by our friends at Kaleidoscope Adventures and the Kinnison Choral Company. Now, Dr. Amy Williams, squashing the why. Today on the Music Ed Matters podcast, we're welcoming the executive director of the Savannah Philharmonic Orchestra, Dr. Amy Williams. Hello, my friend.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so excited to have this conversation, and I'm thrilled you live in Savannah.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're not doing this face-to-face, but you're like right down the road.
Absolutely.
I'm so excited that Savannah snagged you. You are such a gem in our community, and you have done so many beautiful things to revitalize the orchestra and musical life in our town. So you have to tell the listeners before I get too excited. Who is Dr. Amy Williams?
So I found myself moving to Savannah with my husband in October of 2020. And that may seem completely crazy to people because I moved from an arts organization during a pandemic to another arts organization during a pandemic. But I saw a community that had so much potential in growth and so much potential in what I believe in is embedding into the community. So a little bit about how I got here. And it's important and it matters as to the whole thing. So I grew up in a town of 4,000 people in rural Massachusetts. Never heard a live orchestra until I was in college, majoring in music.
Whoa.
So, I played in them, and I did the band thing. But I didn't, my parents were blue collar. My mom was a nurse. My dad was a mechanic. When I asked if we could go hear the Boston Symphony that we'd watch every year on TV on the 4th of July, the Boston Pops. And I said, I'd love to go hear an orchestra. And their response was, that's not for us. And it had nothing to do with the commute into Boston, because we'd go into Boston for Fenway games for the Red Sox. And it really came down to Boston Symphony had a attire rules on their website. It had, so like for my parents that didn't grow up with it, it wasn't for them. It wasn't for us. It was too expensive. We didn't know enough. We didn't know anything. So it was off the table.
There were barriers before you even showed up to hear them.
Complete barriers.
But how did they know to let you do music?
I discovered it because I was excited by it. So I was the child that said, watching the Boston Pops, that I wanted to play piccolo because I wanted to stand up during fireworks. It was really like the only thing. And then I was the child that was the music teachers and the band director, right? So my teacher was not a flute player. My teacher was the trumpet teacher. He was a trumpet player because he was the band director of these small towns. He worked within 5 different schools. I know you have some music ed listeners, right? So he did the commute between 5 different schools and different things. And he was great. And he tolerated me that never practiced, right? So I would hang my flute off the stand by the lip plate and let it swing and catch it. I was this person. And
you rested your arm on the chair. That's the worst.
I don't know. Swinging your flute from the music stand's pretty bad.
It's pretty bad.
And so I said to him, and every time he'd send notes home, and my friends received notes home of like, your child should play a different instrument. Your child isn't musically inclined. Like they were real statements of these reports that went home. And I just kept saying, your child needs to practice. Your child needs to practice. Your child needs to practice. And there was one point I was tempted with a microwave timer on. I was tempted to go to my room and record myself on a tape recorder practicing once, so I could just go up and hit play every time.
Gosh, that's a great idea. I mean, don't do that, but what a great idea. We should have known you were going to be an executive director of something someday with those genius ideas.
It could have worked, right? So, fast forward to middle school, and I went to him and I realized, and again, it's just to all of your music education listeners and students and people out there. I went to him and I said, because I realized everyone else could play. So we went to a regional high school and middle school. So 5 towns were coming together, and other kids could play their instrument. And I barely knew what a half note was. And so I walked up to him and I said, I remember his name, Mr. Pereira, I would like to take some private lessons. And I remember saying this, and I said, because I really need to learn how to play my instrument. And his statement was, yes, you do, but you need to practice. And I said, yeah, I know, I got that. Okay.
Oh my gosh. This is such a great story. Music people listening, y'all, this person could be in your class right now. It's okay.
Exactly. That's why I say it, right? Like it's some music band director out there, like Mr. Pereira did not give up on me. And really, we've all had these students, like you really want to. You all just like want to bang your head in the wall. So, when I started taking lessons, I took it from a high school student, right? Low investment dollars because my track record was not high. And then a couple years later, they said, we want someone from the flute or clarinet section to play bassoon or oboe. And everyone else wanted to play oboe. I didn't know what the bassoon was. So I took it home.
No, to practice.
And fell in love with it, right? And so completely fell in love with the bassoon as soon as I had it in my hands. But no one in my family knew what it was, so I took it home, and we all, like the music teachers out there, the bassoon is complicated to put it together the first few times. So by the time I took it to both sets of grandparents, my aunt's house, everyone,
awesome.
It went around the family.
It's like bring your bassoon to family day.
It is. And so eventually, by the time that circle happened, I could take it out of the case, put it together, barely play a 1 octave F major scale, and put it back in the case.
Oh, okay. But at least you were practicing.
Right? Like But once I got the bassoon in my hands, I never wanted to not practice. Like it was never a question of like, this is just what I did.
Oh, okay. Life lesson right here, my friends that are listening. If at first the instrument is being swung off of the music stand, perhaps try another instrument. Okay, good. Don't give up.
Yeah, don't give up. So that's kind of so my parents inherited this musician in their house. And it was like we all learned along the way. So, no one knew what it meant to do this. I took lessons that were 45, 50 minutes away eventually on bassoon because that's where the teacher was. My mom was willing to drive me. She did fall asleep during more than one lesson and woke up kind of cranky. But, it's parents willing to do it. And we learned what a bassoon costs together. And I had to work a lot of hours to pay for the bassoon cost. And so when I went to music school, I went because kids from small towns don't get performance degrees. Kids from small towns are teachers, right? Like this is the only thing I knew. Performance degree was risky. So I was a performance major and an education major. My first education class, and I was very quiet. I was very introverted. My first education class was class voice.
That's great for the bassoonist that's introverted.
Oh yeah. So, so one semester into music education, I called my family and I said, my mom, my parents, and I got both parents on the phone because that's like, need to rally people together. And I said, I'm dropping music education and I'm going to be a performance major. And I know that means I'm going to have to go straight through. My teacher didn't really give me an option. She said, it was 1998. She said, you're going to get your doctorate. So just plan on going to school through, straight shot through, to put your head down and finish it because you're going to need that degree. And, and I was going to freelance and teach at the college level and have this great career and, be in one of the top tier orchestras across the country. All of those amazing
dreams, yeah.
We need to believe in when we're going to put ourselves in a practice room 5 hours a day on top of ensembles and rehearsals. But I do love that I now have friends that are vocalists, and I love telling them that I quit music education when I had to take class voice.
That's crazy.
And learned that I was a soprano in class voice. Like, it was bad.
I mean, I can only imagine you started your life swinging your flute on the stand. So I bet you were epic in class voice.
It was awful. And I tried to get him to let me sing alto because I was like, no, I'm an alto. He's like, no, you need to learn how to sing correctly and you're a soprano.
Oh, I would have said the same thing to you. I'd been like, yeah, that's cute that you think you're an alto, but we're going to teach you some technique and you're a soprano.
Yeah. So
I love it. Okay. So you decide to go the performance route. Your parents are supportive. I have a very important question at this point. Have you been to Boston to see a real orchestra?
I've still not been in Symphony Hall in Boston.
Really?
Which is so funny because it's now my job, and I've been to Cleveland and I've been to Cincinnati and I've been to Chicago and LA Phil and but my first orchestra was Cayuga Chamber Orchestra at Ithaca College.
Wow.
And it was a professional orchestra, but that's what it was. And
So
I was
you didn't
playing
hear it till college.
Yeah, I heard it in college. And I knew, and I was really an idealistic person. I thought that from a player position that I could change the direction, like that I could find the kids like me out there.
Meaning what?
Meaning find the kids and help kids discover music. Really, that's what it was all about. Like, right, like I love the togetherness that music brings. And that's what I discovered playing in an orchestra, hearing an orchestra, honestly, singing Sweet Caroline in Fenway Park. It really doesn't matter. Like we all come together in music. And that's what really sort of started in undergrad and then master's and my doctoral work. And I was still thinking I was going to teach at the collegiate level and have a playing career until I was in my last semester, my doctorate, quarter of my doctorate at The Ohio State University, when I realized I didn't want to teach at the collegiate level at all. And I was getting a doctorate and I didn't want, and I wasn't, the freelance life wasn't going to be good for me because I like health insurance and I wanted to know how I was paying rent, and at that point I was getting the calls for gigs. I was playing with Columbus Symphony. I was playing with Springfield Symphony. I did a lot of gigs, but you would get the call and they'd literally say from the personnel manager, hi, we're wanting to know if you can play second bassoon this weekend. You have 24 hours to return my call. And if you don't return the call in 24 hours, they're on to the next person because they have to be.
Wow. Okay.
So I was, and if you say no too many times, they're not going to call you. So that was stressful. And I was like, I can't do that. So I found myself getting a job, moving across the country to Los Angeles and ending up working with the Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra with a doctorate, very green. And I was the production assistant, or production associate, I think was my first title. Moved up to production manager and just learned how to use the skill set that I had from my degrees to put an orchestra on stage and all that comes with it, but also having the understanding that I had from my playing career to know what it was like to be a freelance musician, right? And that these guys, they're stacking gigs left and right. And so really got my feet wet, very green, got my feet wet at Los Angeles Chamber Orchestra, had a great boss because the rule was that everyone in the office, no matter what your title, went to every board meeting. You sat in the back of the room, you couldn't ask questions. And then after the board meeting, we'd have a debrief in the office where we could ask all of our questions. That's where I learned how to read a budget. That's where I learned how to build out a season. So it was all of that really led me into things. But the element that was still missing from production was I wasn't bringing a community together. It was missing. So was able to go up to Santa Barbara where I was a director of music education, or a director of education with the Santa Barbara Symphony. It was a brand new job. And they, in interviews, I fell in love with it because there were no rules to it. They said, here's a job. We don't know what it should look like. We don't really have a job description. Just build it. And, taking everything I learned, and I would say even things that I learned from when you defend your dissertation and you're in your doctoral work and you're being pushed around, that's a skill set. And that's a skill set of how to hold your own. And when you're being pushed by board members and community. So, started with a program that served 1,600 kids. When I left 7 years later, we had 10,000.
Wow. So you were doing what you wanted in the long run.
I was doing what I wanted.
That togetherness and community building through music.
Yeah, the togetherness from the standpoint of education and the grassroots of it. And so, after 7 years, I realized that I had done what I could there. And I moved on I needed to move up to really build this out. So moved on to work with Camerata Pacifica, a chamber music organization that's phenomenal. Out of LA, I was their first ever managing director. And again, learned a lot from just programming and how to market programming that was sometimes challenging. We put Steve Reich's different trains on stage, and which isn't, if you state that, it's not an easy entry point for someone, but it's a phenomenal piece. And
one of my favorite composers, hands down.
You have to hear it live, right? So we actually marketed an entire concert with this on it, only using Beethoven Violin Sonata. And it was a Valentine's Day concert. So we basically tricked the audience into the hall, by just didn't
tell them.
We just didn't tell them. But they
So you removed the barrier. You took away the barrier.
Right. And there was a lot of question of what's going to happen? We are putting a Valentine's Day amazing concert and out of Beethoven Violin Sonata and not referencing the hard and emotional, not hard, but the emotional piece we're putting on stage. And what was so great was that I'll never forget, the lobby was packed after the concert. People just didn't leave because they were talking about different trains.
Wow.
So again, it's and you assemble all these pieces. And then I had the opportunity to come to Savannah Philharmonic and found an orchestra that really had a lot of barriers up. And Savannah in general, with community and with the arts organizations, which Santa Barbara did as well. And I did this there also in building. No one was picking up the phone and calling one another. There was like this fear. We were all competitors. Like, no, we're not. We're all just together. We're all together in music. And we're not competitors. We don't need to be competitors. Yes, we're all fundraising. Yes, there's X number of dollars in the community. But if the community first and foremost knows who you are, then the dollars will follow. I was responsible for my own budget in Santa Barbara Symphony. So as my education budget grew, which it did, my first year was $160,000, and my last year was $500,000. And I had to raise that. If I wanted to grow programs, I had to raise that. So it's not hard when you just put community first, and when you have community-driven programming, when you have community-driven expectations of your staff, when you're in alignment with your board, when every decision you base it off of is of two things: what is your mission, and who is your community? Things come through, and pieces come together, and that's what really helped us with the Savannah Philharmonic through the pandemic, was that we put programming on stage. It was small, but we put community first. And we spent a lot of time in that space of asking Savannah, what do you need from the Savannah Philharmonic? Like, what do you like? If you've never been, why? And just different things.
So we started this conversation kind of haphazardly saying, don't give up, keep showing up, keep trying things. And we've kind of shifted into that same mentality. It's through the constantly trying things and figuring out how to apply your experiences and your knowledge to take the next step in the right direction. You're such a great example of that. Can I ask, we can talk more about programming in a second, but I want to ask, for teachers and future teachers listening, whether they're band, choir, general music, a lot of times it feels like you're an island. What are some of the tips or the starting steps to get to where you can evaluate, does it align with your mission or your objectives, and does it impact your community? What are the steps you start with? What was the first thing you did when you came to Savannah?
Talk to people, not via text, and we're sort of coming out of the pandemic, so not via text, not via Zoom, not via the phone if possible, but talk to people. And I would say, even when I came to Savannah, I picked up the phone with my board of directors chair and my music director, and we called 600 people.
Wow.
We looked at the past 4 years of individuals, and they may not be involved in the Philharmonic anymore, and they may not have answered the phone, but we called them. We said hello, and we said that we were there. And then the conversations just start. And like the way the education program grew in Santa Barbara was, I hung out with parents. I talked to them. I listened to them. And it was more listening than talking. And I think that's the big, that if for a music educator of anything, like that's the big thing, listening. And that's a really key thing to driving and building a community, is listening, and listening to what's being said, listening to what's not being said. There's a lot that's not said that is discovered. It's watching body language, it's reading rooms, and it's really in this in the silence that you hear things. And I think I started by saying I was an introverted kid. I mean, I'm still an introvert, but it's a benefit because you listen and you hear and you watch and you hear how people talk to one another. And then the other piece is that after listening, the next step is if you hear, and I think a number of people hear, and no matter what we're doing in music, we don't do that because of this, or we don't do that because of this. And it's taking that and hearing it, but then thinking to yourself, why? And not being afraid to step on that why and squash it.
Oh, I love that. Don't be afraid to step on that why and squash. Okay, so give us some examples.
Well, classical music is great because we have so many rules that are so outdated. For example, we changed the name of Picnic in the Park was something that goes back to Savannah Symphony days, really. It's a large concert in Forsyth Park, has 10,000 people, but it has been called Parker's Picnic in the Park, has been called End Market Picnic in the Park. And when we listened to the community, it came to our attention, and just talking to wait staff at restaurants or people that I'm out for a run with or just in the community with, they were like, oh, there's this great, you're new to town, you have to go to this great concert in Forsyth Park. It's in every October. It's so much fun. And I'd say, who puts it on? And they'd say, Parker's has an orchestra, the city has an orchestra. So we had a huge branding issue because the Philharmonic had been putting it on. And one of the things I heard, and I was like, we're going to change the name of it. And they said, well, you can't, it's tradition. And I'm like, why? I have to have a community that knows who the Philharmonic is for so many reasons. So we changed the name to Fill the Park. And we got maybe a couple of comments on Facebook, and a couple of people were like, well, you're hurting years of tradition in the Savannah community. And it was like, but we had a great time, and we were able to move the concert this year in a pandemic to a different place. And people slowly are like associating Fill the Park with the Savannah Philharmonic. And I should say we spell Phil with PHIL. We overuse that heavily, but it's all for a purpose.
Yeah, you're branding. You're making sure you're using. It goes back to what you said earlier. You're using what you learned in your degree. You had to brand yourself as the best bassoon player.
Mm-hmm.
Now you're learning how to take that same thing and put it in different organizations to make it thrive.
Yeah.
For the togetherness. If you don't have that, there will be no opportunities for togetherness.
Correct.
It makes so much sense. Oh, this is awesome.
So I would say that's the biggest example that we have of squashing the why. And then
I think I'm going to have to title this Squashing the Why. Like, that's just so much fun. Okay, so I want to ask you another question, because you're really good at this. You're really great at establishing partnerships and building great collaborations. What are some examples, and what are some ideas or steps you could give us to get started on our own ideas?
Some examples are partnerships with, last year we did a partnership with the Telfair. So we had a concert at the end of the year. It was in June. We had our whole orchestra together. It was family-based. And so we called the Telfair to have an arts and crafts project where kids could make shakers and musical instruments to play with the orchestra. And they were a lot of fun. So the reason for that is that, again, we're all in this together, and no one arts organization can literally afford to do everything, right? So like no one has the budget to do that. It's crazy.
And no one should.
And no one should. And so like for something like I wanted kids to make musical instruments. Well, I'm not an artist. I am far from an art. Like I play an instrument. I think might be fun to make a musical instrument, but I don't do that, right? Like I'm not going to come up with the resources to do that. I don't have the team to do that. So why wouldn't I just call the Telfair museums in town and say, hey, want to play with us? And it's how do we, and I do think it's like, how do we play together? Like how do we literally play?
How do we play together?
So that was one, that's a lot of fun. But then, I would also say we have to have partners. We have partners with the Savannah Music Festival and different education groups in town, because again, we teach fundamentals of instruments. We don't teach jazz. We don't teach blues. We don't teach any of that. And I may have some musicians that know how to do that can do that, but they're not on the ground all the time. And kids still need to learn the fundamentals. So it's utilizing us to teach the fundamentals to them, because if we're successful, then suddenly Jazz Academy at the Savannah Music Festival has almost more kids than they know what to do with, right? The Youth Symphony has more kids than they know what to do with and that are representative of Savannah. If we go into every school, like if we do our part. The perfect example was a collaboration I had of flashback to Santa Barbara. We collaborated with a mariachi ensemble that wanted kids to play mariachi on violin. And I was in a panic. And again, they called me and they said, we need a teacher. We need a violin teacher. My first statement was, we don't teach mariachi. Like, so I don't know who I'm going to send you. And they said, no, send me your teacher that's great with the basics and great with the little kids to teach them the basics. They said, once you do your job, we'll take them and we can teach mariachi. He was like, and that was really the first time I really learned that, because, and the gentleman was so sweet about it, because I'm like, I don't know how to teach mariachi. I don't even know how to find a violinist to teach mariachi. And he was like, no, I don't. He's like, look, no, you're from New England. You're not, no.
Please don't try. Please don't do that.
No, don't help us. Like, help us with the fundamentals.
Right.
And that was where it was really key, because he's like, if you remove your programs from the schools and teaching the kids the fundamentals, then I don't have any kids for the parades and for the different things once we do teach the mariachi. So that's the key point of we don't have to know everything.
It's how do we play together? How do we show up to the sandbox?
Out there, right. The music educators out there, you don't have to know everything. You just have to start playing matchmaker with pieces to get things happening and moving.
Visual aids are fantastic too. Like, these are so good. We could call this a slew of things. Squash the Y, play in the sandbox, play matchmaker. This is so much, and you make it seem so approachable. I know when I ask people, as chair of the National Committee for Advocacy and Collaboration for the Choral Directors Association, I get asked all the time, how do I have time for a collaboration? How do I find someone to collaborate? But you're making it so easy. Just pick up the phone and call who you need help with.
Yeah, and I would say you don't have time to not collaborate.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have time to not.
Right.
Because we all know how fast, especially music education, we all know how fast that moves. Mm-hmm. And it's changing left and right? So it's like, you don't have time to not have the relationship with the local arts organization or the museum, or because all of that, like, we're all flying by the seat of our pants to some extent as core requirements change, and no child left, and we have No Child Left Behind, and ESSA, and every student succeeds at, like, there's been a slew of them in the past.
And it's just changing moving forward as you look at the needs of our students are changing.
Absolutely.
And if you don't get flexible and find people to play in the sandbox with, how are you going to meet the needs of the students? This is so cool. Okay, so we've talked about how you are utilizing your music degrees to do something totally not in the classroom and not with private bassoon students. Right. We've talked about the power of partnerships and collaborations and how to get them started. Can you talk to the people out there that are thinking, I'd really love to move into more of an arts admin role. I'd love to start getting into these things. What are some of the steps that people listening could do to get more involved in arts administration?
So there's a number of them. There's always my route, which is that I took, and it was find that entry-level job and be young and hungry to learn. I was really willing to learn. I was willing to ask the questions and grow into it. And know that I was 27 when I did that. And my colleagues that were also in my same age bracket were further along because they didn't go through school. So really, like, age doesn't matter. But if you're hungry to learn, find that entry-level job and just learn. And whether it's development associate, marketing associate, administrative associate, arts organizations are small. So you could have a development associate position and be learning about programming and the marketing efforts and things, because we all have to rely on it, right? So our development associate puts together all of the board materials for every board meeting. Well, read them. If you're in that job, like, you're the one at the photocopier printing 20 board packets, and you can read them and ask, how do I read financials? I try to always have one-on-ones in the summer with my team so that we learn other pieces of the job. So there's that route. There's classes that you can take in nonprofit management. The League of American Orchestras is a phenomenal organization that has essentials of orchestra management training programs that are over the summer. They're 10 weeks. They're really intensive programs that crash course you basically in lots of things and then help you place into jobs. I'm not convinced. And at one point I thought, oh my gosh, to move up in my career, I'm going to need an MBA. And I really didn't want to go back to school, especially for an MBA. And I don't believe that you need that. I think that you just need to be willing to learn because I will be asked, when I've interviewed for jobs, I have been asked like, oh, do you have an MBA? And it's no. And I'm sure like I've not received jobs because I didn't have that, but they weren't positions that I would have been good in anyways. Right. So it's knowing that too, that as you interview and as you market yourselves, really say what you believe in, because I'm where I am today and growing an orchestra in a community because in an interview, I said truly what I believed. I did not say what I thought a committee or an interviewer wanted to hear.
Yes.
Because that's the only way you're going to match into a position that's the right fit for you. But it's also just utilize people in your community. Make sure that you're reaching out to a colleague or an arts administrator or anyone. Like I'm always happy when someone reaches out and they said, I'm applying for this job. Can you look at my resume? Can you look at my cover letter? Always make sure someone is looking at that, because a lot of times, especially to the music education listeners out there that are looking or thinking about that, the way you put that together, you have so much skill set, right? You can program, you're well organized, you can schedule, like you have all of these key components, but your resume needs to reflect those and not I've been teaching for X number of years with this many kids. Like, no, how many kids have you grown in your program? Right? Like what have you done to build your program, to build program growth, to recruit and all of that? Like, what are those skills? And take them and put them into an arts admin position, because that's where the crossover lies.
It's so much alike what you said to the partnerships and the collaborations. You have to be authentic to who you are, and you have to be willing to show up and play matchmaker and play in the play box, but you have to remain authentic to your knowledge, your experiences, your mission, and your community.
Right.
Wow. This is so, like, you have given so much information today. Like, like in fast time. It's so good. No wonder you're an executive director. Line them up, knock them down. Get to the point. You're so good. I'm really thankful Savannah has you, and this conversation is such a treat. Before I let you go,
okay,
are you reading any great books that we need to know about?
I am. And so this book is in alignment. I read workbooks. So this book is in alignment with it. It is Sacred Cows Make the Best Burgers.
Sacred Cows Make the Best Burgers. My vegan heart broke for a second, but then I read the tagline. What's the tagline?
So it's developing change-driving people and organizations. So it's this idea that we live in these organizations that have, right, like calling it Picnic in the Park, that was a sacred cow. Like, you cannot change that. And like, yes, you can. So that's really yes, you can. And so that's what I'm reading, because as we build the Philharmonic, every rule, and my team knows it, every rule is always on the table, and every rule can be thrown off the table at any time. As we bring an arts organization completely out of a pandemic and growing it within the community. So that is my book.
Yeah, no wonder you're squashing Y's left and right. That's so good. Thanks
it's sort of top of mind lately. So
that's what's needed.
Right.
Oh, that's so, see, I'm so happy. Okay. I always let the guest share one thing that really matters. Like, I've given way too much talking this time, but you've made me really excited. What is the one thing you want the listener to walk away from this episode with?
Know the community that you live in. Let that drive what you do.
Perfect. That is perfect. Know the community you live in and let that drive what you do. It has been lovely. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
All right, who is ready to play in the play box? Sandbox? Toy box. The box at Burger King that you jump into that has all the squishy things, that's gross. Anyway, who's ready to play? Pick up that phone. Make the call. You are not on an island. We are all in this together. And it just takes being clear with your mission or your vision or your objectives and being willing to ask for help. Dr. Amy Williams has offered so many tools today for collaboration, partnerships, so many things to keep us going forward. We know that there's a lot of revolutionizing ahead of us. The world of music is changing, but isn't that exciting and isn't that cool? I hope that you've had a lot of fun listening to this episode. It was a blast to record. She's super easy to talk to. But if you do feel alone, we're all here for you. Join the conversation. Patreon.com/musicedmatters. Shoot me a message, emilybirch.org/contact. Find me on social, Dr. MEB on the Instagram, or whatever you need. We're here for you, because in case no one has told you today, you, my friend, you matter. We all know that music matters, especially meaningful collaborations, community partnerships, and figuring out ways to break down barriers and squash the why. I'll see you next time on the Music Ed Matters.